It started in 1587. A group of 115 English settlers, led by John White, arrived on Roanoke Island, an isolated strip of land off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. But John White wasn't just any leader. He was an artist, a cartographer, an explorer, handpicked by Sir Walter Raleigh himself. White had already mapped parts of the New World and documented Native American tribes. But this time, this wasn't just about exploration. This was meant to be permanent. Among the settlers were men, women, and children, including White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. Their goal: establish England's first permanent colony in America. But Roanoke was doomed from the start. The land was harsh. The soil was too sandy to farm. Supplies were dangerously low, and worst of all, the local Native American tribes were wary of the newcomers. A year before, English settlers had landed here and had terrible relations with the tribes. Tensions had already boiled over into bloodshed. This new colony, they inherited that hostility. The Croatoans, a small friendly tribe, tried to act as mediators, but they warned White. Not everyone would be so kind. With winter approaching and food running out, the settlers begged White to return to England for reinforcements. So he left. He kissed his daughter goodbye. He held his granddaughter one last time, and he swore he would return in just a few months. But John White was about to face a nightmare he never expected. White arrived back in England in 1588, expecting to immediately return with supplies. But England was at war. The Spanish Armada, the most powerful navy in the world, was preparing to attack. Queen Elizabeth ordered that no ships could leave England. Every available vessel was needed to fight the Spanish. John White was trapped. Months turned to years. And with each passing day, he imagined what was happening back in Roanoke. Had his family survived? Were they waiting for him? Or had something else found them first? It wasn't until 1590, that 3 years later, that White finally secured passage back to Roanoke. But when he arrived, everything was gone. The houses, dismantled. No bodies, no graves, no signs of a struggle, just one word:
CROATOAN.
Carved into the wooden fence post. John White never got to find out. A storm hit, forcing his ship away. He would never return, and the fate of Roanoke would become one of history's greatest mysteries. For over 400 years, people have tried to explain what happened to the settlers of Roanoke. Some say they were wiped out, others say they simply moved. And then there are the darker theories. Theory 1, massacre by Native Americans. Before White's colony, an earlier group of English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island in 1585, led by Ralph Lane. Their mission: to establish a military outpost to secure England's claim in the New World. But things quickly turned violent. The settlers, unfamiliar with the land, struggled to find food and began relying on the local tribes for survival. At first, the CROATOAN, Croatoan, and other Algonquian tribes traded with them, but as the English demanded more and more resources, tensions grew. Lane, paranoid that the tribes were plotting against him, launched a brutal preemptive strike. He and his his men ambushed the CROATOan chief, Wingina, beheading him and putting his head on a stake. The settlers fled back to England soon after, but the damage was done. The English had made powerful enemies, so when John White's new colony arrived just 2 years later, many believe they inherited the hostility from the past settlers. And when White left in 1587, some say the neighboring tribes took their revenge. But here's the problem. There were no signs of a battle, no bones, no weapons, no burned houses. The fort was intact, not destroyed, and the word Croatoan was deliberately carved into wood, not something people under attack would have time to do. If there was a massacre, why was there no physical evidence? Perhaps some of the colonists were captured or killed. But if the entire colony had been wiped out, there would likely be some trace of violence. Theory 2. Destroyed by a hurricane. Roanoke Island sits in what is known as the Hurricane Corridor, a stretch of the Atlantic coast regularly battered by violent storms. Some historians believe that one of these massive storms could have struck the island, leveling the colony, sweeping structures into the sea, and drowning the settlers. It wouldn't be the first time a hurricane wiped out entire communities, leaving little to no trace behind. Could Roanoke have suffered the same fate? On the surface, it seems possible. The colony was built on sandy, unstable terrain, making it vulnerable to storm surges. The settlers' wooden homes and fortifications wouldn't have stood a chance against 100-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. A storm of that magnitude could have flattened everything, drowned dozens of settlers, and scattered the remains far from the island. But here's the problem. The word Croatoan was deliberately carved into wood, not hastily scrawled. If the settlement had been suddenly obliterated by a hurricane, who had time to calmly leave a message behind? And why were there no signs of wreckage? No pieces of shattered homes? Some have suggested that the settlers may have predicted the storm and evacuated before it struck. But even if that were the case, where did they go? So while a hurricane could have played a role in Roanoke's fate, it doesn't fully explain the disappearance. Which means the real answer lies elsewhere. Theory 3. Starvation and desperation. The colony had little food. Supplies were meant to last only a few months, just enough to sustain them until fresh shipments arrived from England. But those shipments never came. Without reliable trade with the local tribes, and with their crops failing in the sandy soil, the settlers would have been forced to ration every last scrap of food. Hunger turns to desperation. As starvation set in, bodies would have weakened. People would have become too frail to work, too exhausted to hunt, too delirious to think clearly. Some experts suggest the colonists may have turned to something darker. Cannibalism. It happened at Jamestown years later, in 1609, when settlers endured the infamous starving time. Archaeological evidence at Jamestown has shown that at least one girl was cannibalized, her bones bearing the telltale knife marks of human butchery. Could the same thing have happened in Roanoke? If the settlers resorted to cannibalism, why did they disappear entirely? Wouldn't at least a handful have survived? Or did the starving colonists decide to abandon Roanoke entirely in search of salvation elsewhere? And if so, where did they go? The mystery deepens. Theory 4, they left and joined the Croatoans. The most likely explanation: Croatoan people, a friendly Native American tribe, lived on Hatteras Island, about 50 miles away. White himself believed the settlers moved there, since that's the word they left behind. Artifacts have been found on Hatteras Island: European-style pottery, a sword hilt, and a slate writing tablet. Some Native American oral histories claim pale-skinned people with gray eyes lived among them. Roanoke wasn't lost. It simply became something new. But maybe, just maybe, if you walk through the forests of North Carolina, listen closely, because the voices of Roanoke are still there.